disco, 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 disco. This is tricky. This is tricky disco. Disco. 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 This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky.
This is discotronic.
Application error. The application has run out of memory. Now the system starts to reboot. Tricky disco. Disco. This is tricky disco. Disco. Tricky disco. This is tricky. This is tricky. This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky. This is tricky. This is tricky. This is tricky. Disco. Disco.
This is discotronic.
Tricky disco. Tricky disco. Tricky disco. Disco. This is tricky disco.